Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining the first in our series of master classes on public policy. Today's speaker is John Phelan, who is an economist with Center of the American Experiment. John has degrees from the University of London and the London School of Economics. If you want to ask a question at any time during John's presentation or to make a comment, what you need to do is to hover over the bottom of your Zoom window and see where it says chat and click on chat, and a box will pop up where you can type a question or a comment. You just type it in and we'll see it. And we'll see how many questions we get, but we'll probably take some questions during John's presentation. So if there's something that's not clear to you or that you'd like to see followed up on, feel free to type in a question. And then at the end of John's presentation, there will be time for questions and answers. So there will be another opportunity then to get any questions that you might have responded to by John. So thank you all for joining us. John Phelan, take it away.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you. It's quite an amazing, weird thing that we're going through, and it's good that we can have these things that kind of, just keep things going along. What I'm going to talk to you about today, the first of our master classes, is what state governments can do to influence the economy. Now, this is something that we do a great deal of work at the center. It's kind of our bread and butter, really. Basically, as you can see on the slides there, governments have available to them, this is all governments, not just state governments, but governments of all levels have available to them 4 policy areas. Now, these are monetary policy, which it's a bit technical, but in simple terms, it's essentially the regulation of the quantity of money in the economy, trade policy, regulatory policy, and fiscal policy. Now, we can ignore 2 of those for the purposes of this talk because Federal Reserve monetary policy is run by the Federal Reserve, which is a national body. So this is kind of exogenous, to use a jargon phrase, to our analysis. So it's outside of what we're analyzing. And what we see with monetary policy is that the monetary policy's effects are uniform across the country. So if interest rates go up, if the Federal Reserve puts the Fed funds rate up, it goes up in Minnesota, it goes up in Iowa, it goes up in Oregon, California, etc. So if we're looking to explain the differences in state economic performance, then we're not looking at something like that. We're not looking at something that's uniform across. A similar kind of thing with trade policy. Actually, trade policy, state governments don't really have any say there. In fact, just as a historical point, one of the reasons that we moved from the Articles of Confederation to the US Constitution with a stronger central government was precisely because there was a concern that the US states then would erect tariff barriers towards each other. So in theory, what you have in the US is complete mobility across the United States of labor, capital, goods, and services. So trade policy, its effects actually, trade policy's effects can be different at different states. So for example, if you're a heavily ag state like Iowa, then things that affect agricultural policy will have a disproportionate effect on you. But we're not going to look at those today, maybe a subject for another day. Today we're going to look at the 2 fields where state governments can really have some pull, and that's regulatory policy and fiscal policy. This chart here shows you, I think, why this matters. This shows you real GDP growth for all the US states and the US itself. So real terms adjusted for inflation from 2000 to 2018, which is the most recent year for which we've got this data. You see, as you look at the screen, you'll see on the left-hand side, Michigan is the worst performer on this measure, followed by Delaware, then Connecticut. And as you move across from left to right, performance gets more impressive. You'll see the light blue bar, that's us, that's Minnesota. That's our real GDP growth since the start of the 21st century. Unfortunately, we are to the left of the black bar, which is the US rate. So over the course of the 21st century thus far, our GDP growth rate has lagged that of the nation generally, and we talk about that and the reasons for it at great length in our new report, which you can find on our website, The State of Minnesota's Economy 2019. Now, all the states, as you look at the chart to the right of the black bar, are those who've done better than that average. And you'll see North Dakota there, an absolutely stellar performer. Now, North Dakota is an interesting one because obviously a lot of that's been driven by the kind of energy boom that they've had. Now, you can say that these things, you know, a lot of that's been driven by the fact that they have these natural resources that they can exploit. So those two, you know, that's not policy, that's exogenous to what we're investigating. Well, yes and no. Yes, it's kind of exogenous that they have these natural resources, but it's a policy question whether they exploit them or not. When you look at Minnesota, for example, in the north of the state, where we have, you know, an awful lot of mineral deposits that we could exploit, state policy does make it more difficult to do that. So even though you may have these exogenous endowments, state policy can have a big say on whether they actually deliver you any benefits or not. Now, one of the things about GDP is it's kind of a factor of the productivity of your economy, what you're producing, and also of, you know, people moving in, because as people come in, they produce goods and services. And also one of the things about population movements is that is when people vote with their feet, they never vote more honestly, you know, because they're putting themselves and their families on the hook for the consequences directly. So it's interesting to see where people are voting in terms of where they see opportunities, which is really why people move. And this chart here shows you population change for all US states since 2000 to 2018. I say population change, not population growth, because in the case of West Virginia, you've actually got a slight decline there in terms of population. And again, as you look at the chart and you move from left to right, you see that population growth rates accelerate as we go across. Again, you see the light blue bar there, Minnesota, that's us. And again, we are to the left on this chart of the black bar, which is the US average rate. So all the states to the right of that black bar have outperformed the United States average in terms of this. And you'll see states like Nevada, Utah, Arizona, Texas, Idaho, Florida, Colorado, etc., who have been the states that have really been, people have really invested in those by moving there. So let's move on now to talk about some of the specifics. Regulatory policy is the first one we'll discuss. Regulatory policy is a funny thing because people often talk about regulations, too many regulations, but it can all sound a little bit vague sometimes, you know, a bit nebulous, you know, like you're just kind of conjuring something up. Well, that does actually relate to one of the difficulties that we have when analyzing regulations economically. There was a scientist in the 19th century, Lord Kelvin was a British scientist, and he said a quote, which as near as I can remember, said that if you can't quantify something, your knowledge of it is of a very basic and rudimentary nature. Now, he was a physicist, if memory serves, and an awful lot of economists have taken that on board. So economists, I think, sometimes fall into the trap of if you can't put numbers on something, they don't talk about it too much. So we have an issue here with regulations. I mean, taxes, it's very easy to quantify taxes, or comparatively easy. You can go and look up a tax rate. You can look at the thresholds and calculate some kind of burden, you know, theoretical burden of taxes. You can't do that with regulations. So when you look at the burden of regulations on an economy, it's a much more difficult exercise. Now, there is currently a program at the Mercator Center at George Mason University, which is attempting to quantify regulations at the state level and the regulatory burden. And I am enormously grateful to the folks there for doing this and for attempting it. But I do have some issues with their methodology. So for example, essentially how it works is they upload all the state regulatory codes to a website or online, and then they do a word search where they look for words like shall not, must not, have to, etc., etc. And they look at how many of these words appear, and then they use that as a measure of the regulatory burden. Now, I think that's misguided for a couple of reasons. The main one being that it's sometimes better to have 10 precisely worded regulations, for example, than it would be to have one vaguely worded regulation. So, for example, if you're a business owner and you've got 10 regulations, but each one is very specific in its requirements, well, then, you kind of know what you have to do. If you've got just one regulation, which is very vaguely worded and very imprecise, well, you don't know whether you're in compliance with it or not. So that massively increases the uncertainty of the regulatory environment, which is a huge cost in itself. So that's why I don't think that you can just use these kind of word count measures, for these things. Another aspect as well, of course, is that the regulatory burden is not just a function of how many regulations you have. It's also a function of with how much zeal these regulations are enforced. There was a case recently, as an example, in Minnesota of a family dairy farm that wanted to expand its operations, but it wasn't able to do so because the Minnesota Court of Appeal ruled that the MPCA had to take greenhouse gas emissions into account in assessing whether this small family-owned dairy farm could expand. So that's kind of crazy, really. The contribution of this expanded dairy farm to global CO2 emissions. I don't know if there are numbers small enough to calculate it, but yet here we are, and we see in direct terms the economic consequences of this regulatory burden and the regulatory zeal. So if you want to think of it kind of like a mathematical equation, the regulatory burden you can think of as, the number of regulations multiplied by the zeal of enforcement. But again, that just kind of highlights the problem. How do you put numbers into these terms? It's very, very difficult.
Hey, John.
Yep.
John, let me just interrupt you for a second with a question. And I know you're going to get to tax policy here in just a couple of minutes, but one of our viewers asked a really interesting question, and that is, what is harder for businesses to manage, especially small businesses, tax burden or regulatory burden? And just to add my own 2 cents worth, I think sometimes, it's easier for the reasons you said a few minutes ago to focus on taxes because you can look at the numbers, 10% top income tax rate, whatever it may be. And sometimes I think a lot of people underestimate how important the regulatory burden is on business. What do you think about that?
I think that's absolutely right. And for the reasons that I've explained, I think it's much easier for a business to deal with a tax regime than it is a regulatory regime. If you look at, so for example, a lot of regulatory requirements, and the more there are, and you'll know this, from your law days, there are entire departments of major companies that exist for no other reason, floors and floors and floors of people in law buildings and other offices, at big companies who exist solely to maintain regulatory compliance. Now, smaller businesses, they can't afford that. So that becomes very, very difficult for them. And it really is one way that regulations can kind of bake in an advantage for big businesses and bigger businesses. And there's an awful lot of kind of gray area around regulation, like I say. So yeah, absolutely. I think navigating taxes, as difficult as that can be, is less difficult than navigating the regulatory environment. The good news is, some good news, is that Minnesota, on these George Mason Mercatus numbers, is actually comparatively lightly regulated compared to other states. But I would say again, remember the quantification issues, and also remember that they take no account of how zealous the enforcement bodies in Minnesota are. And I would throw this out to people to think about themselves. Do you think our regulators are more, bang on in terms of enforcing these things in other states? Well, like I say, we've talked about regulations and how to quantify them. There's still the issue that people think they're kind of nebulous. And what do you mean by regulations? Well, let's give some specific examples. Minimum wage laws are an example of a regulatory policy. Minimum wage laws essentially, just in case you've, what they do is they make it illegal to hire people below a certain wage. All they do really is they amputate the bottom of the labor supply curve. But the difficulty with that is, I mean, there's all kinds of justifications for this. Workers need to earn more money. But the difficulty is with this, that wages are not driven by political commands. Wages are driven by market forces. And in this case, in the case of wages, what drives wages is productivity. It's become very unfashionable to say this, and there's this one chart that people always show with a line, of productivity, or wages since 1973 and productivity since then, and they diverge massively. I've written on the website about why that's not true, and there's a lot of recent research actually that shows that the link between pay and productivity is still there. But the impact of that is that when you enact a minimum wage law, all you're doing is making it illegal to hire lower skilled workers. Now, in many cases, lower skilled workers are younger workers because they just haven't had the time to accumulate the skills to make them more productive. To give you a kind of a rough numeric example of this, if hiring a worker adds $15 an hour to a business's revenue, then the business will pay anything up to the $15 an hour to do so, because they will be adding more to their or less to their costs than to their revenues, which is the $15 an hour. If, by contrast, a worker only adds $10 an hour to a business's revenue, then a minimum wage of $15 an hour will mean that the business is paying, that the costs for the business of the hire are greater than the revenue. And no business that wants to stay in business will be adding more to its costs than its revenues. So that is why minimum wages actually have these impacts, negative impacts on employment, particularly on youth unemployment. And one of the issues that we have in Minnesota is that we have seen a very large decline in youth labour force participation this century. And we also have an above federal minimum wage, state minimum wage. So that's a specific example of regulation there. Another one, and I think this is interesting for several reasons, is rent controls. Now, rent controls are actually, they're kind of like minimum wage laws in reverse. Where minimum wage laws are price floors, rent control laws are price ceilings. And what they say is you can't charge more than this, for a particular product or service, in this case, housing. But again, remember the minimum wage laws just amputate the bottom of the labour supply curve. All rent controls do is they amputate the top of the housing supply curve. And there is actually a recent paper that's very interesting that shows that when you liberate, housing supply, people move up, into these kind of expensive things, and that reduces prices lower down. Because if these rich people can't live in these nice places, then they move down, and that pushes everybody down. So what you actually see there is that rent control laws, they're the same as minimum wage laws. It's market forces that drive these things. And so rent control laws, what they're doing is they're making a big mistake, a huge mistake, in thinking that the price is the problem. The price is not a problem. The price is a big flashing signal telling you that there is a problem somewhere else. So in this case, it's, a shortage of supply relative to demand, or an excess of demand relative to supply. But those are the issues. Those are the causes. The price is just the symptom. And a rent control law, it does nothing, absolutely nothing to deal with the underlying causes of unaffordable housing. Essentially, what causes that is housing regulations, which we'll come on to in a bit. But remember, you need to be dealing with the causes of problems, not the symptoms of problems. Another specific law that we have is occupational licensing regulations and occupational licenses. You will have seen, if you go and get your hair cut, that you sit in the chair and there's a little certificate. It's blue, I think, or purple or something, from the Minnesota Board of Cosmetologists, telling you that the person cutting your hair is licensed to do so in Minnesota. Well, that's great, but I would invite you to take a look at me. I don't require very much in terms of hair care. And the thing is, to get one of these licenses, you actually have to go through a fairly intensive course to accumulate skills and then to prove that you've got these skills. And this includes things like handling hazardous materials, handling hot waxes. I don't need a hot wax, my lord. So it's completely unnecessary. And there's no reason that somebody needs to go through all that just to give me a buzz cut. And yet we have these laws. And the interesting thing with occupational licensing laws is that they're always touted as being for the benefit of the consumer. That we're the people who benefit from this. We're being protected from dangerous barbers or something. Well, there's several things about that. Firstly, the market will protect you against dodgy barbers. Because if I go somewhere and get like a really bad haircut, I'm not going to go back. And people who see me are going to be like, well, why did you get your hair cut? And I'll tell them, well, it was that crummy place, and they won't go there. So that you may have heard that old joke about, Anne Rand Paul and Paul Ryan walk into a bar, barman serves them alcohol, and they all die because of no regulations. Well, of course, A, the barman is going to get sent down for murder, and B, he's never going to sell another drink to anybody again. So if you want to stay in business, you actually do have an incentive to provide a quality service. And you don't necessarily need this elaborate occupational licensing regime that we have, and which has grown massively in the last 20 or 30 years to protect people. What's the situation with occupational licenses in Minnesota? Unfortunately, this chart here is not the easiest to read. This shows you the growth in the occupational licensing burden in all the US states between 2012 and 2017. And because it's not the easiest to read, I've put that big purple arrow there. You can see that's Minnesota. Our regular occupational licensing burden grew at the 11th fastest rate over those 5 years. So that's not good. We don't want to be seeing that. Coming to housing regulations now. This is another interesting example, I think. Because this is another situation that goes back to the rent control thing. Rent control is to deal with this price signal. The price signal. That's the problem, and it's not. Housing regulations are really where the issue is, because what housing regulations do is, by being so onerous, they make it illegal to build affordable housing. So that's why we have an affordable housing problem. It's because in many cases it's illegal to build affordable housing here. There was a recent report from Housing First Minnesota, which looked at the costs of building a house in Lake Elmo and building an identical house just across the St. Croix in Hudson, Wisconsin. And they looked at how it was vastly more expensive to build in Minnesota than it was to build in Wisconsin. Now, obviously, the weather's not different in the two places. So it's not like you need, to insulate very, very differently. We just have, more onerous regulations, taxes and fees that go onto these things. But what I think is interesting about this, and it makes the broader point about regulation, is that here we have a government intervention, housing regulations, that creates a problem, a shortage of affordable housing. And so the solution is more government regulation in terms of rent controls. And so you often see this kind of, way that regulation just expands like Topsy, it just grows, and it's really what lies behind an awful lot of government growth, is this constant expansion. You go in to fix a problem, and that creates unintended consequences, and so you have to go in and fix those problems. Because if there's one thing that I could get people to take away from this, one thing above all, it's that the vast majority of the consequences of any action are unintended consequences. And that's exactly what you see in the case of housing regulations. And if we want to have a quick look and see where Minnesota stands on that, you'll see that we're in a particularly bad situation here. This map is a couple of years old now. It was put together by the Pioneer Press. And it shows you that actually Minnesota has some of the most expensive housing of anywhere in the US away from the coasts. Now, so this is an interesting thing. People will talk about, well, high labor costs are high, that's why housing's expensive. But there's no real reason why labor costs should be much higher in Minnesota than they are in, say, Atlanta or St. Louis or Dallas, which are all places there that you can see have much lower housing costs. So that's one of those things. If you're looking for a reason why these things differ from place to place, it's no good really looking at things that are uniform from across all these places. So like, monetary policy or whatever, or even, this kind of, another thing that people say is, shortage of building materials and they're more expensive, timber and whatnot. Well, okay, but that's going to be the same across the country. That's not explaining the differences between places. You have to look at things specific to the places to explain the differences. And so that's, one of the things that we see here, and this is one of the big problems that we have in Minnesota as a public policy issue, is the shortage of affordable housing. And I think this makes it very clear.
John, I know you're going to go on to taxes here in just a moment, but one of our viewers makes a great point that I want to just briefly ask you to comment on. He points out that this talk about regulations is especially timely with respect to hospital certificates of need, and the fact that since, I forget the year now, but the 1980s, Minnesota has actually had a moratorium on new hospital construction. So now an epidemic comes along and people say, oh, we're short of hospital beds. Well, why is that? It's this ill-advised attempt at regulation.
Absolutely. And that's a really good example. At the moment, we're faced with this public health crisis and we desperately need face masks. Well, the CDC regulatory regime is making it very difficult for those to get made. We needed tests. The FDA approval regime made it very hard for those to get done. And now we need medical personnel and medical professionals. And that's becoming difficult because we have all these, if you're licensed in one state, well, that's great, but you can't then go and work in another. Colorado just recently, a week or so ago, overturned one of their regulations so that anybody now who's licensed anywhere can go and practice medicine in Colorado, which is a great thing. But you have to wonder, why this isn't always the case. I mean, if you're licensed in Florida, but you're in Colorado and you want to go and work, and now you can, but you couldn't a week ago. Are you now safer for the people of Colorado than you were a week ago? What's changed? All that's changed really is that the coronavirus has kind of exposed a lot of this for the nonsense that it is. I would not quote this as a fact, but somebody did tell me that in all the United States, there were just 14 doctors licensed to practice in all 50 states, which is incredible, really. And it goes back to the point about, mobility across the United States. We've actually seen, population mobility has massively declined, and part of that research shows is down to occupational licensing. And just a comment on the thing about the bed shortage, the moratorium apparently exists to protect the consumer. They always say that. So the theory is that if hospitals weren't blocked from building new capacity, we would be flooded with capacity, and we'd have hospitals springing up every which way, and that these would be massively expensive for the hospitals to build, so they would need to recoup that capital cost with higher prices, which would harm poor people. There's actually, all the evidence shows that this is bogus, complete nonsense. Just thinking about it for about 10 seconds shows that it's nonsense. Why isn't there a McDonald's on every single street corner? It's not because the state government in its wisdom protects us from that with a moratorium on McDonald's. It's because McDonald's knows that there is a cost to doing that is just not justified by demand. And so if we can trust McDonald's, I think we can trust the hospital companies. Really what it is, and what a lot of these regulations are about, is about protecting insiders. They set up barriers to entry. And you see that, so like I say, if you're a cosmetologist and you've got to be, if you're a licensed cosmetologist, you don't necessarily want to be in competition with a lot of unlicensed cosmetologists. So it's great to have this thing that stops people competing with you, because that enables you to increase the prices that you can charge. It's what economists call rent seeking. Which is generally a bad thing. So we'll move on now to fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is taxes, spending, and borrowing. Now, at the federal level, there is some, so there's a whole other federal level on top of what states do here, just the same as with regulation. There is some interplay between federal fiscal policy and state fiscal policy. So, for example, we have the state and local tax deduction, the SALT deduction that you may hear a lot about, which allows you to claim back off or to offset against your federal taxes the amount that you pay in state and local taxes. So if you're like a high tax state, Minnesota is a high tax state, then you can effectively get the federal government to reimburse your residents for the high taxes that you impose. So the federal government kind of, is picking up your tax bill and insulating the people who vote for higher taxes from the full effects of higher taxes, actually. And so there's some interplay there between state and federal taxes. Another one is with the estate tax. We're one of the few states that maintains an estate tax. We'll talk about it a bit more in greater detail shortly. But the federal government has an exemption above which, below which they don't charge you an estate tax. And that exemption keeps going up and up and up. And the states that maintain an estate tax are kind of chasing to catch this federal thing and raise their exemptions as well. Minnesota's not. Our exemption is below the federal level, which makes the whole thing kind of triply stupid. Just a quick point about borrowing here. Borrowing is not a dirty word. It's fine to borrow to invest. Because so for example, if you take a driving license, if you borrow the money to pay for driving licenses or driving lessons, and that enables you to get to jobs, it enables you to do jobs, and so that will increase your earning capacity down the line. So that's a genuine investment. But one of the problems that you have in politics is that almost any government spending gets called investment, whether it's investment or not. When you go to the restaurant, you don't invest money in a meal. When you go to the bar, you're not investing in beer. I've tried that on my wife; it doesn't work. So there's a big difference there. And one of the issues, and another sensible reason to borrow is consumption smoothing. So at the moment, I think our economy is, not in the best of trajectories. And it would make sense in this situation to borrow to kind of smooth over the consumption in the same way that it would in a wartime or something like that. The difficulty there, of course, is that if you've already got $18 trillion in debt and $1 trillion a year deficit, that just goes to show that we need to get federal finances sorted out. But borrowing is not a dirty word. If you're borrowing to pay for current expenditure, then you're in trouble. Fortunately, at the state level, you often see that we have balanced budget amendments, and Minnesota has one of those. So Minnesota isn't really in a situation like a country like Greece is. So in many respects, Eurozone countries and US states are the same, except for this one. So let's move on now. I think a really important question with fiscal policy, it's a funny one actually, because you probably wouldn't have thought about asking this a couple of years ago. Why does government levy taxes? When I was doing my undergrad, which is not so long ago actually, you would have said, well, it's to pay for stuff. There are, for example, public goods. Defense, for example, is a classic public good. And what that means is that the private sector would not provide the optimal amount. So now, give you the example of defense. If I pay for, a nuclear weapons system that, deters the Soviets or something like that, it stops the Soviets attacking me, great, but it also stops the Soviets attacking you, whether you pay for it or not. And so there's no incentive for me to pay because there's no incentive for anybody to pay because they all get the benefits even if they don't incur the costs. And so with that incentive, nobody pays and the nuclear weapon system doesn't get produced. And so you do see, that there are these things. So defense is, classic public good. Whether that means that an awful lot of the things that are called public goods now genuinely are is an open question. One of the textbooks I used was called Economics of the Public Sector by Joe Stiglitz, and it used on the cover a picture of a lighthouse because a lighthouse is the textbook example of a public good. In actual fact, there's a great paper by the economist Ronald Coase, which shows that there is actually a very long and vibrant history of the private sector providing lighthouses, including some of the ones that you see in Minnesota. So, public goods in some respects, not all of them are. And again, the question of investment, we just talked about that. But I think, like I say, a couple of years ago, this would not have been a difficult question to answer. We raised taxes to pay for stuff. But now it seems that there is a very different idea that's rapidly gaining popularity. Certain political parties, some of their leading, most visible members are big supporters of this idea. And that's the idea that you levy taxes to engineer society. And specifically to stop there being any rich people. There's a big difficulty here because these people tell you on the one hand that the rich are going to pay for the Green New Deal or free tuition for everybody, and then they tell you that they're going to use taxes to eliminate rich people. If they're going to eliminate rich people, how are rich people going to pay for everything? I'm not clear how they square that circle. I'm not sure that they've even tried actually, but there you go. But it's an interesting question now that there are some people, and some of the economists who push this idea are specific when they say that the point of these tax rates is that nobody would actually pay them because there would be no rich people to pay them. And of course, you know, that goes completely against the idea that you raise taxes to pay for stuff. And again, this is a question I throw out to the audience, you know, which of these do you believe? Do you think that taxes are raised to pay for stuff? Or do you think they should be used as tools of social engineering? Now, one of the key things, this is another big takeaway from today, is that taxes are incentives. And that in actual fact, an awful lot of public policy is based on this idea. So it's based on the idea if you tax something more, you get less of it. So if you want less of it, tax it more. Smoking is a classic example of this. You know, policymakers hike taxes on cigarettes, ostensibly and explicitly with the idea of, you know, saying that people, you know, trying to encourage people to smoke less, which is fine. Okay, I accept that logic. And at the same time, people say, you know, if you tax something less, you'll get more of it. And the recent discussion of angel investor tax credits in Minnesota is an example of this. You know, essentially, it's trying to encourage investment by lowering the tax burden on investment. So here we've got two examples of policymakers who know that taxes are a negative incentive. And if you increase taxes, you get less of something, and if you decrease taxes, you'll get more of something. Now, the difficulty is that you have to apply this logic consistently, and policymakers seldom do. So this idea that, you know, taxes are a negative incentive, that doesn't stop the same people that say we should hike taxes on cigarettes to discourage smoking, saying that we can hike taxes on corporations and they'll just carry on, you know, paying taxes, or that we can hike taxes on individuals, income tax, and they'll just carry on, you know, working and paying taxes as they were before. Of course they won't. You know, if taxes are incentives one way, they're incentives the other way. And it makes absolutely no sense to apply this logic partially. Either you believe in this logic and you apply it across the board, or you think it's nonsense and you ignore it across the board. But what you shouldn't do is pick and choose little bits, and we'll accept it here, we'll accept it there, we'll ignore it here, we'll ignore it there. That is that's no basis for consistent public policy. Now, I made a point earlier about unintended consequences, and fiscal policy is rife with these. Essentially, people don't always respond the way you would like them to respond. So, for example, we have the estate tax that I talked about. We have one of the heaviest estate tax burdens in the United States. Now, does that mean that people just, you know, they don't like it, but they're like, oh, well, shucks, I better guess just pay the estate tax? Well, no, they don't. People move. Not everybody, but at the margin, people move. And when we're talking about something like the estate tax, that margin can make a big difference. So, for example, recent research has found, and we did a report on this a couple of years ago on Minnesota's estate tax, and we found that when somebody moves out of the state so that they don't have to pay the estate tax, they take with them future payments of income tax, sales tax, etc., etc. And which of these is greater? Is the revenue that the estate tax brings in 1 year greater or less than the revenue from other taxes, future payments, that it pushes out in that year? And we found more than likely that it was the case that the estate tax lost the state government money. Another paper that came out very recently for the National Bureau of Economic Research used a completely different methodology and found the same thing for Minnesota. What was interesting there is they found that across the United States, on balance, the estate tax brought in more revenue than it pushed out. But for 4 states, that wasn't the case, and we were one of them. And all those 4 states, and this is an interesting point, were the states with the highest top rate of personal income tax. So there's a trade-off there, and economists are all about trade-offs. There's a trade-off there, and it says you can have a high top rate of personal income tax, or you can have an estate tax, but you can't have both. And that's a big lesson. And we can't, you know, keep pretending, you know, that people aren't just going to respond to these incentives, because they do. Vape taxes are another example of this. And this, I think, is a good example because it shows just kind of how wacky politicians' thinking can be sometimes. With vape taxes, in 2013, we hiked vape taxes in Minnesota so that they were about like 95% of the tax on actual just nicotine products. And now this is the state government, by the way, that says they want to stop people to stop smoking. And so they raised the price of a substitute good which seems kind of weird to me. That seems like the opposite thing would happen. And that's exactly what research recently found. It was research specifically on Minnesota. And they found that actually all that happened is people who would have switched into vape products away from nicotine stayed smoking nicotine products, and that smoking was a lot higher than it would have been without this tax hike. So this just goes to show the left hand, the right hand of state government, doesn't really know what it's doing. And so again, I would say always bear in mind, at this point, that most of the consequences of any action are unintended consequences. That brings me to the end of my slides. And actually, there's one more. Actually, this here shows you Minnesota's top and lowest rates of income tax compared to the top rates of income tax in all the other states. And this is an interesting point. It goes back to the point I made about people moving out and people actually leaving. Because what you see here is that, we have a high top rate of income tax. We've got like the fourth or fifth highest in the US after California, Hawaii, New Jersey, and Oregon. But we also have a bottom rate, a starting rate of state income tax, which is higher than the top rate in 25 states. That's up from 23 states in a previous report, by the way. And so it's not that Minnesota, we don't just tax the rich. We're taxing everybody kind of pretty high. And you see the effects of that here. What this shows you is based on IRS data from 2011 to 2018. And it shows you the net inflow of taxpayers to Minnesota by the income of the primary taxpayer over that period. And you see that lower down, so on the left-hand side of your screen, we're seeing net inflows of people. So we're seeing net inflows of residents earning up to $50,000 a year. Beyond that, once you get to incomes of $50,000 a year, it flips, and we start to see net outflows of people. Now, this is an interesting thing, and it's a difficult issue because, and I want to make a point here, when we talk about low incomes, I do mean people with low incomes. Some people think it's code for these other things. No, it's a specific term. Low income means low income. Low skill means low skill. And what this chart shows you, if you go back to the point that we made earlier about how productivity drives incomes, that means that higher income workers are higher productivity workers. So what this chart shows you is that we are gaining lower productivity workers and losing higher productivity workers. Now, that's not a good place to be. Productivity really is the be all and end all of economic growth. And there's several ways that we can boost productivity. But one thing that we can do is to make sure that when we have productive workers in the state, we keep them, and that when we don't, we can attract them here. And I think that what this shows you actually is that our tax policy is completely antithetical to that. It's just not, up to the job.
Say, John, let's stay with this chart for a moment, because the numbers are a little bit fuzzy. I want to make sure everybody absorbs what this chart is telling us, because I think it's so important. So at the far left, you have the lowest income levels, and then as you get to the right, you have the higher income levels.
Yeah.
But what this chart tells us is that Minnesota attracts people who earn less than $50,000 a year. And
Absolutely.
Every income level over $50,000 a year, we are repelling residents. We lose more people to other states than we gain. That's the basic message of this chart, right?
That is exactly right. And like I say, so when you talk about the impacts of people, or the fiscal impacts, the unintended consequences of fiscal policy here, you're not talking about millionaires moving out. I'm talking about people with incomes of $50,000 a year and over, which is not rich, by any stretch. It's okay, but you're not some cigar puffing, top hatted robber baron if you're on $50,000 a year. And I think like I say, I think that is borne out by this really, which is these kind of high tax burdens. You hear other things, for example. I'm going to have to skip back a few. Paul Krugman, for example, likes to make out that these arguments are that one of the reasons we've seen a movement towards so-called Sunbelt states is because of the invention of air conditioning, which makes it more practical to live in these places. Another argument I heard recently was that we don't do that well, and our population growth is expected to be slower than the national average. And that's because we're not near the coasts. Everyone wants to live near the sea or something. But just to go back to this chart here, and you see some of the states that have gained population. Like Colorado's done a lot better than we have. Is the weather in Colorado much better than it is here? I don't think.
John, another example is Utah. In all these charts
Yeah.
that show state performance, Utah is right up near the top. Now, Utah is not coastal, it's not urban, it's not glamorous, right? But Utah is a great example of a state that's doing very well in population growth, also in economic growth. And they're doing very well in large part because of good, solid policies at the state level. Is that fair?
Absolutely. You see Utah there, and it's done second best after North Dakota in all this. And of course, this is not to say that any one thing kind of explains it all. But if you look for Utah here on this chart, it's to the right of Minnesota's lowest. So their top rate of personal income tax in Utah is about 4.95%. Our lowest rate here is about 5.35%. So I'm not saying that's the only thing that goes into this, but at the margin, it is a thing. There is an awful lot of research, and I've written about this on our website, that shows that people do move in response to taxes. We might not like this fact, we might bemoan this fact, but you have to deal with the facts as they are, not as you would wish them to be. And too much public policy thinking, I think, at the moment is based on, dealing with a world that we would like to see. So yeah, this brings us, like I say, to the point about unintended consequences. We've always got to be thinking about, so we yank these taxes up, we do this, we do that, we impose these regulations, what really are the consequences of this? When housing regulations were imposed that massively raised the cost of building houses, nobody was sat there thinking, oh, this is great, this is going to make housing more expensive. Nobody sets out to make housing more expensive. Maybe the builders do. But the aim is always something else. So I sat in a meeting with a local city council a while ago, and they defended these housing regulations to me by saying, well, we've got to fight climate change. And apparently, this is all part of that. And I thought to myself, well, yeah, okay, but, accept, we can talk about trade-offs, accept that what you're saying there is that affordable housing is something you are willing to give up to fight climate change, and be honest about that. Be honest about that trade-off. Like I say, economics is very largely about trade-offs. There's no free lunches. And you can't pretend that these things don't exist. These unintended consequences don't exist just because you find them awkward. As I say, that brings me to the end of my my slides. I'd love to hear what questions there are and any comments.
So, John, there's a number of questions and comments that people have been typing in here, and I want to toss a couple of them to you. And I would encourage everybody who's viewing, who's got a question or a comment, go ahead and type it in now, and we'll take those questions here to the end of the hour. One of our viewers, John, raises a really interesting point that I'm not sure you've studied in detail, but you may have some thoughts about it. He says, when predicting the future economic performance of states, what impact will the actuarial soundness of public employee retirement plans, pensions, and health benefits have? For example, Wisconsin is a relatively high tax state, but it also has the best funded public employee retirement plans in the country. Won't that over time give Wisconsin a big advantage in attracting and retaining employers because they won't need to greatly increase taxes to pay for these benefits? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's absolutely true. Because like I say, remember that, a lot of these states, they can't run budget deficits. So if their pension burdens, if they're not fully funded and they have to pay them out of tax revenue, they're going to have to put taxes up to pay for this. I mean, they may cut spending elsewhere to pay for it, although I think that is not the first option they choose. And if you look at Illinois, for example, which is to some extent, if you think of the United States economically is a bit like the Eurozone, Illinois is a bit like Greece. Everything is kind of, whatever's going to go wrong is going wrong in there first. And if you look at Illinois, they are constantly trying now to dream up new taxes and to plug the holes in their public pension system. And also that will be the case across the US. And it will be the case more so in states with these bigger funding gaps. We have problems in that in Minnesota as well. And so what that does mean is that in the future, the state government is going to raise taxes. And if you look at the evidence and think to yourself, well, state taxes are they retard economic growth, then if we're constantly yanking them up to try and pay these public sector pensions, it's going to retard economic growth. That, of course, at the same time will feed back and negatively impact your ability to do this. So you will get stuck in this kind of downward spiral, really. So yeah, it's absolutely true, and it's not good.
John, one of our viewers points out that Tennessee is another state that is in the process of doing away with its personal income tax. This viewer says Tennessee is going to have no state income tax by 2021. Currently, it taxes only investment income, not wages. How concerned are you? Here in Minnesota, we've been recently raising, especially our top rate of income tax. How concerned are you about our ability here in Minnesota to compete in the future with these very dynamic states like Washington State, like Tennessee, like Texas, that have no state personal income tax at all?
Well, it is a big problem. Like I say, I often say, taxes aren't the only thing. We do have some great advantages here. We have an incredible work ethic. We have, labor force participation rates, employment, through the roof in Minnesota. And it's interesting, actually, when you look at these charts of labor force participation by state, it's Minnesota and all its neighbors, and Utah, funny enough, is always up there, that are at the top. Now, if you think of Minnesota, Wisconsin, North Dakota, South Dakota, Iowa, there's a big range there in terms of state economic policy. And yet you actually see, in terms of employment and labor force, whatnot, similar outcomes. So there are other things that drive some of these things, but at the same time, you're swimming against a tide if you keep, burdening yourself with these issues. So we may have, things like social capital, which I think is a big part of these employment things, because again, when you look at a map of social capital, and this is another one of those things that hasn't been talked about enough, I don't think, because it's hard to quantify. But if you look at the states that have high levels of social capital, it's all the states that have high levels of employment. But you can burn through social capital like you can burn through any capital. And so what these things do, these high taxes, at the margin, they make a huge difference. And they really will, handicap our ability to compete. I would advise anybody who's a bit of a masochist to go onto the website and find where I've written about a couple of studies that show specifically, actually, how Minnesota's high taxes have hobbled our state sports teams by making it more difficult to attract a sufficient quantity of kind of top talent to the state. Now, if that doesn't make you, want to cut taxes, I don't know what will.
John, another viewer asks a great question. He says, if we aren't funding our pensions, are we really balancing our annual budget? And that I think that's a tremendous question. At the state level, we all know our federal government runs deficits, huge deficits every year. Most states, including Minnesota, have constitutional requirements of a balanced budget. And so, in my opinion, and I think this is the point that this viewer is raising, how do states deficit spend? They're not supposed to be able to deficit spend, right? They're supposed to have balanced budgets, almost all of them. But the way that the state can deficit spend is by passing out IOUs to its public employees that it does not have the ability to pay. And states like Illinois, and I think Connecticut and others, have gotten into really deep trouble by doing that. Is that right?
To an extent, I think what they're doing is they're making commitments that they won't be able to keep, or they certainly won't be able to keep with the current tax regimes that they have. But they still won't be able to deficit spend. So what they'll be doing is essentially they're enacting tax hikes and spending commitments on people who aren't yet voters. In many cases, people who aren't yet born. So that's a very morally dubious thing to be doing. And it's absolutely true with all these things that if you look out, these things are just going to get worse. And should they be included in state borrowing? Yeah, probably. I mean, for example, the federal government and its Medicare and Social Security shortfalls. That's all liability. That's all stuff that under statute the federal government is required to pay out, and yet it doesn't show up on borrowing figures yet. But you look at these liabilities, this tidal wave of red ink that's just over the horizon, and that's a huge problem, and it will be for the states as well. All these kind of clever off-balance sheet borrowing, it's very dodgy.
John, I want to wrap up with a question from one of our viewers. He says, is there any hope that state policymakers will ever learn Economics 101? And of course, part of your life's work and part of our effort at Center of the American Experiment is to communicate these basic lessons about public policy to legislators. And you and others at the center spent a lot of time doing that, testifying in front of committees. We put out reports, we communicate behind the scenes a lot with policymakers in our state and to some degree with policymakers in other states. Based on the experience you've had so far, John, how would you answer that question? Is there any hope that someday our policymakers are going to absorb the lessons of Economics 101?
No, is a short answer. And I give you, I mean, you may be able to tell from the lockdown beard that I'm growing and the color of it. I'm old enough to remember the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, and communism and socialism following Tsarist Russia into the dustbin of history. And I remember back then, the end of history, no one believes in that nonsense anymore. It's free markets and democracy all the way. And now look around and see what there is. Memories are short, and here we are now, people talking about nationalizing everything. Socialism is apparently popular amongst the young again. And so it's one of these things, you can teach a lesson, but you have to keep on teaching it, and so even if you think you've won, it's like there's an old poem, Drake's Drum, in England, and it's all about how Francis Drake, who saw off the Spanish Armada, his drum that he had on his boat is in a museum somewhere, and the old legend is that if England is ever in mortal danger again, Drake's drum will start banging again to summon him from the grave. And you've got to be kind of like that. I think people you'll never definitively win, and the reason for that is that there's too much incentive for politicians to be wrong. It's very, very easy for a politician. The public pensions is a great example. If you stand up and say, I legislate a massive hike in teachers' pensions, well, all right, if it's not being paid 20, 30 years, then you sound like the most generous guy in town and they'll vote for you, but you're not the one who's going to be paying for it. By the time those bills start coming due, you're long gone. And that's why it's very rare that you get politicians, who are willing to actually do difficult things within a short time horizon, because the electoral cycle, 2, 3 years, 4 years, it's so the odds are against learning. You're incentivized not to learn.
One of our viewers types in here a quote from Thomas Sowell that I know you have used in the past, John. You're very familiar with it, and it's a great note to end on. The Thomas Sowell quote is, "The first rule of economics is scarcity. The first rule of politics is to disregard the first rule of economics."
Absolutely.
And that is something that we deal with at the center every day as we're trying to influence and are influencing public policy in Minnesota. And the only thing I would add, John, on a little bit more positive note, you're absolutely right about the perverse incentives that tend to exist in politics. But when we look around the country, as you pointed out earlier with some of your charts, there's a wide range of policies that are in fact being adopted at the state level. Not all the states have gone blue. In fact, most of them haven't gone blue. And the ones that are sticking with solid, economically sound policies are doing very, very well. And so I think that we need to continue to pound into our policymakers the fact that if we want to compete, we've got to have the same kind of policies that the states that are doing the best have put into place.
Absolutely.
Well, with that, it looks like our hour is up. I just want to close by thanking all of you for participating. We hope you've enjoyed this program. We have 4 of them scheduled. They're at the same time, noon at Wednesday for each of the next 3 weeks. And we hope you'll tune in again. This has been a lot of fun. So thank you all very much. And thank you, John Phelan.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure.